Hi, good day, everybody. My name is Ethiopia Yurt, and you are watching Black Mental Health Matters. Here at Black Mental Health Matters, we are centering the voice of Black folks all around the globe and highlighting mental health issues that affect us everywhere. Okay. Today, we will be speaking about what are dissociation and dissociative disorders? And today we have as our special guest, Dr. Noriel Armstrong. How you doing, Dr. Noriel?
I'm well. How are you? Glad to be here.
Yeah, actually, we have you as Dr. No, right?
Yes, we have. That is my nickname. I've been going by that since I got my doctorate in counselor education and supervision in 2015. Um, Struggles, well, not even just struggles with people saying my name. I just thought it was cute and simply something that as I got comfortable with my students, and as they got comfortable with me, I allowed them to say Dr. No instead of Dr. Armstrong. Some people still call me Dr. Armstrong, just depends upon the setting that I'm in. But for this setting, with talking about Black mental health matters, kind of have it a little bit more informal, a little bit more relaxed, and just call me Dr. No.
So, yeah, thank you so much, Dr. No, for showing up today to talk about this very, very important mental health issue. It's such well, I'm just going to say how I would say it's such a beast in the way of just like the complexity of
Mm-hmm.
what we're going to speak about today. So let's just jump on in and just talk about what let's break it down. What is dissociation? If you can just let us know what that's about.
Yes. So I'm going to tell you the DSM 5 definition, and then I'm going to try my best to kind of put it in layman's terms or regular terms because it is very expansive and there is a lot to it. But dissociation is characterized by disruption of and or discontinuity in the normal integration of consciousness, memory, identity, emotion, perception, body representation, motor control, and behavior. The symptoms of dissociation have the potential to disrupt every area of our psychological functioning. The symptoms are experienced in two ways: positive dissociation symptoms, which are fragmentation of identity, depersonalization, and derealization, which are unbidden, intrusive intrusions into our awareness and behavior, with accompanying losses of continuity in subjective experiences. So, all of that, simply put, is that sometimes there are these unwanted intrusions that show up in your mind and in your actions, along with losing consistency of subjective experiences. So you're losing parts of time, you don't have memory recall of some things. You don't feel like you're in your own body sometimes. You don't feel like you can recall certain things. You have forgetfulness or what we call amnesia. And then the second type of symptom is a negative a symptom, which it is the inability to access information or to control mental functions that normally are readily available and amenable to access or to control. Symptoms such as amnesia. So something as simple as, hey, what happened last night? Or what happened 2 days ago? You consistently cannot recall, and it is stronger or bigger than just regular forgetting. Like, oh yeah, I forgot what happened yesterday. It is a consistency of an inability to pull on things that you should easily be able to pull on. And so those are the negative symptoms of dissociation. And the positive symptoms are that fragmentation where you feel maybe outside of your body. You don't feel connected to yourself or to the world. You almost feel like you're above kind of watching, or you're in seeing out, but not through your own eyes. So it is very expansive. It's very complicated. Um, and it is highly difficult to diagnose. And it takes a lot of time through therapy, through assessments, through testing, psychological evaluations to really finally diagnose someone with a dissociative disorder.
Yeah, I'm sitting here taking a deep breath off of that because it is, like you said, you use the word expansive, and it's just like that is expansive, because within dissociation you have like the positive and the negative.
Mhm.
Is there a
Mhm.
reasoning behind that you know of, about like why something is labeled positive or negative?
Not that not that I know of. Most research that I have found in working with one or two clients with dissociative identity disorder, or at least with some dissociations, most clients or most people who have the diagnosis can have one or both. It can be, you can have some of the negative, you can have some amnesia, you can have some of the positive, you can have some depersonalization or some derealization. Um, it doesn't have to be one or the other. It can be both, and those are both symptoms of the larger disassociation.
Yeah. So let's just jump right on in with so we spoke about dissociation.
Hmm.
What are dissociative disorders?
So dissociative disorder is the one that we hear about the most, is dissociative identity disorder, formerly called multiple personality disorder. It is one that is heard most often in common conversation with people. It's the one that, if you're going to see a movie about it, like Split, or TV shows. I think it was the many sides of Jane was a show on A&E where she talked about and let cameras follow her. I think it was like a 9 episode show, showing her going through having dissociative identity disorder. So that's one of the main ones that people hear about the most. There's also depersonalization or derealization disorder. Um, there's also um, other specified dissociative disorder and unspecified dissociative disorder, meaning there's something else, but you can't quite put your finger on it, but you still meet some of the criteria for that dissociative disorder or dissociative pieces of disorder. And so depersonalization is where you have a statistically significant, I should say, persistent. So it's recurring. It's not like a one-time thing, a two-time thing, but a persistent recurrent experience where you are undetached from reality, from your mind, from self, and from body. Or derealization is a persistent, reoccurrent detachment from one's surroundings. So depersonalization, you're kind of detaching from your own self, self-awareness, self-identity. So that's the mind, the self, and the body. Derealization is a detachment from your surroundings. So you don't feel like you're in a space that you are aware of or that you know of. And so you can have one of them. You can have depersonalization without derealization, or you can have symptoms of both within that dissociation or dissociative disorder family. Um, and so there are certain things where, like, if you do have dissociative amnesia, most of the time you will not have dissociative fugue. And so fugue is kind of where you feel um, out of your body, kind of like you're floating, you're not really present, you're not really there. If you have dissociative amnesia, 9 times out of 10, you won't have dissociative fugue. And dissociative amnesia is fundamentally the inability to recall autobiographical information that is inconsistent with just normal forgetting. So again, it's not just like, oh, I can't remember what I did last week. What was going on last week, Tuesday? It is a consistent inability to recall. And a lot of times, according to research, according to the DSM-5, people with dissociative amnesia don't know they have dissociative amnesia until someone is asking them to recall something and they can't do it. And so it's like, you don't know what you don't know until you don't know. So until somebody is asking you, hey, what happened last night? You're like, I, I don't know. Or somebody's like, remember last night we went to such and such and such and we had, margaritas and tacos, and you're like, no, I don't. Well, what about last week when we did? And then it starts to kind of, and so that's why I say it takes a while to diagnose any of the dissociative disorders, because it's not something that is automatically known to the person. and it's definitely not automatically known to the therapist. So through going to therapy, through having evaluations, through having assessments, through talking with family and friends, you can start to kind of put the puzzle pieces together. And it's really what it feels like. It's like you're putting a puzzle together and you're trying to see how the pieces fit. And when it doesn't fit, okay, well, let's try something else. When this doesn't fit, let's move over here. And so you spend a lot of time working with the client just trying to figure out what is happening. Are they dissociating? And if they are, is it depersonalization? Is it derealization? Is it amnesia? Is it identity? And so there's a lot of factors that go into dissociative identity disorder, figuring out, diagnosing it, and then working to help the client cope and maybe even treat it.
It makes sense. As you were talking, I was just thinking about, like, if I had a friend and they couldn't remember something, I'd be like, oh yeah, that's weird. But I don't know if I would make such a big deal out of it until I saw a pattern of it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, well, wait a minute, you always forgetting stuff. But like, yeah, I just feel like how, like, I was like, oh, I wouldn't necessarily make a big deal out of it. So it does make sense that it takes time to diagnose this, and then additionally, I could I could see the complexity and, like, the presentation of some of these symptoms, kind of being like, well, is that, PTSD? Is that,
Mm-hmm.
what I'm saying? Like,
Mm-hmm.
it can kind of pick from a lot of different places with some of this presentation of this is dissociation and dissociative disorders. So yeah, like, the complexity is not only in understanding it, because I mean there's complexity in that as well, but it makes sense
Right.
when, like, in that way that it's complex all around in diagnosing and just being able to understand what it is.
Mm-hmm. Very much so. Very much so. Um, it is a very interesting disorder. I've been in the counseling profession for 13 years. I've been seeing clients for 13 years. And I've only had one direct client that has been diagnosed with, and we're they're diagnosed with, but we're also still ruling out other things. And I've been working with them for 2 years. So it is very expansive. And there are other things like you mentioned, like the trauma or PTSD. Dissociative diagnosis are very tied, closely related to. Research has shown, different studies have shown that they share a lot of similarities and are related to stress related disorders, acute stress disorders, PTSD. And so there's certain dissociative symptoms that show up in PTSD and that show up in acute stress disorder. So you're not only trying to diagnose or determine whether a person has dissociative identity disorder, you're also trying to make sure it's not something else. And because you don't want to misdiagnose. And unfortunately, misdiagnosing happens a lot in therapy in general, just because so many things share so many similarities. Um, and so that's why we have what we say rule out. So you want to rule out that it's not PTSD. You want to rule out that it's not acute stress disorder. And so you look at the criteria, you look at the symptoms, and you're like, yeah, they don't quite meet this. So let's move that off the table. And so as you're able to rule things out and move them off the table, whatever you're left with, if the majority of the criteria is met, then odds are that is the best diagnosis to provide someone with, and then work from there. But those are a lot of similar features, and I think there's clients out there who some may believe that they have dissociative identity disorder, and really it's complex PTSD, or it's acute stress disorder. A lot of it still mostly stems from trauma, and so then there's a trauma work that has to come into play as well.
Yeah, it absolutely makes sense. It makes me wonder, like, when I think about traumatic events. I remember watching this documentary. It was a very short documentary, but this woman was talking about, like, the abuse that she suffered as a child. And
Mm-hmm.
it was like this woman had been through a catalog of horror,
Mm-hmm.
And she said that, at one point it wasn't that she literally blacked out. Like, she was conscious, but she was not there,
Mhm.
you know? And I mean, I remember thinking about, wow, like how powerful that is,
Mhm.
that our minds can even do that, right? Like if we're facing something that's extremely detrimental to us, that we can kind of put
Mhm.
ourselves in a place to be able to cope with it, right? To be able to deal with it in the moment. But what I'm understanding from this disorder is that, like, now it becomes something that is a part of your life instead of just being in the moment. It becomes an actual reoccurring event of like disassociation and I mean dissociation and being like away from the, or I don't want to say away, like what am I trying to say here? Like you are not engaged in the way that we would say is the way you need to be engaged in something in the moment. Does that make sense? Am I
It
making sense?
does, it does. I think, like what you were saying, like that catalog of horror, which I love that phrase. I'm like, I'm gonna use that. But this idea that you can, and one of my things that I have grown to, maybe love isn't the right word, but I have really grown to appreciate about our bodies and our abilities is just how much we don't know about what our bodies can do and our minds can do. And like you said, something, the ability to be able to black out, to maybe save yourself from fully experiencing something. Like there's a part of you that is experiencing it because you're physically there and it's happening to you, but there's another part of you that's been able to shut down and turn off and not fully engage emotionally. And so once that trauma has passed and maybe you kind of come back and to one in being, that dissociation then maybe becomes something that is a safety mechanism, a defense mechanism. But like you said, it's that continuous disruption of what we maybe feel is that normal workings of everything. It's abnormal for your consciousness to split into two or into more than two. It's abnormal for you not to be to recall what you did yesterday or the day before with consistency, or that you have no memory of it. It's abnormal for you to perceive yourself inside of yourself or outside of yourself and not connected to. So those are those things that our body or a person's body is doing when they are enduring or struggling with having dissociations, possibly more than likely brought on through some prolonged trauma. There's also research that says, prolonged surgical procedures, or like children having to be going through major surgery at a young age and like constantly in the hospital, like that's a revisiting of trauma. It's not a sexual trauma or a physical abuse type of trauma, but it's still a traumatic experience to the body, being poked and prodded, and this surgery after that surgery, and this it, and so it becomes to be too much. It's like a sensory overload, and
Mhm.
your body has to do something with it. Your mind has to do something with it. So it kind of makes these pockets of space to deal with it, and that's that dissociation.
When as you're talking about this, if you can just share, like, what is the presentation? You gave us some ideas of it, but like, what are some additional characteristics like that folks can kind of know about that? All right, well, lack of memory, having some amnesia, seeing yourself
Hmm.
outside of your body. I was just thinking about that. I'm like, man, I kind of like sometimes I am very aware of that I'm doing something, but is that me looking at myself from the outside? Like, can you explain more about that?
Sure, sure. Some key elements of diagnosis, and I got this list from a fellow therapist who has done a lot of work with dissociative identity disorders and has presented. And I went to one of her workshops and trainings a couple years back. And so these are some of the key elements to kind of help a clinician know that it may be dissociative identity disorder. And so asking them if they've had any issues with their memory, um, asking them if they have gaps in their memory, like they can remember maybe something up till like 4 o'clock, and then after 4 o'clock, they don't have a memory of it. asking them what's next. Like if they remember, when do you then have your next memory? Oh, I have my next memory at 10. So from 4 to 10, you don't have memory of what happened there. And then disremembering. So forgetting birthdays, forgetting death anniversaries, rituals, holidays, just kind of big things that you normally wouldn't forget of close people. Strangers knowing you, but you not knowing them, and then particularly knowing you by a different name. So somebody walks up to you and is like, "Hey, Sarah," and like really having a conversation with you, and you're like, "I don't know who this person is and who is Sarah." Again, telltale signs. If you have purchases, clothes purchases, shoes purchases, or any type of purchase that's showing up on a debit card and you have no recollection of making that purchase, those are some other signs that something is happening. Different handwriting. So looking at writing, you're like, I didn't write, and not just like me, who if I'm rushing it gets really sloppy and you're like, what did you say there? Versus
Mhm.
when I'm taking my time, it is completely different handwriting because it's a completely different identity alteration of who you are that has come to the forefront. If you had a previous psychotic diagnosis or psychotic feature diagnosis, um, because a lot of times with dissociative identity disorder, an individual suffering with DID can hear and often see their other parts in their inner world. So if you think about sometimes when you feel like your conscious is talking to you, or like you're cooking and you're cooking, but you're not really focused on cooking because you've done it so much, it's just kind of habit, like you just know how to do
Mhm.
it. And you're thinking about your shopping list, or you're thinking about, I need to go clean this room, and so your brain, you're doing two different things. And so, or when you're kind of doing meditation, you're imagining yourself on the beach. So if you think of that, but all the time as an inner world, and so you're seeing these other alters, these alterations inside this inner world. So not only are you visualizing the beach, but you see the beach and you see these other alters on the beach. Maybe one's in a bikini, maybe one's a guy, maybe one's a little kid. And so oftentimes when you have clients who have a diagnosis of DID or are on that path to figuring that diagnosis out, they will speak of seeing this inner world and seeing their alters interacting in this inner world. I had that a lot with with my client that had it. And then disconnection from self, from visual self. So kind of staying away from mirrors, not wanting to take showers, and the shower thing was really interesting to me because I had not heard that before until I started working with this client and started doing the research. And some of it is dealt with the trauma. You know, taking a shower, you're very vulnerable. Most of the time, you're completely naked and undressed. You are wet, so you're slippery, kind of can't get your grip. And there's not really anything in the shower that you can use to protect yourself. And so it never really dawned on me how unprotected you really are when you're in the shower, or how vulnerable you really are. And so if someone has had some severe trauma, sexual, physical trauma, um, taking a shower sometimes is a very scary thought. But then also connecting with your body, because if you feel disconnected from your body, how must that feel to then see your naked body and clean your body, but you don't feel like it belongs to you? So,
Yeah.
like, am I cleaning somebody else? So, showers can be very difficult. Mirrors, looking at themselves because you maybe don't see who is looking back at you, or the person doesn't look like what you see in your mind. And so, like, who is this body that I'm looking at? Because that's not the body I see in my head. So, those are some of those things that if you know of someone or have a client who is kind of talking through some of those things, or sharing that those things are happening with a consistency, not just once or twice. Oh, I bought, I don't remember buying these flowers, but consistent like purchases, or people are calling them different names consistently. It's that persistent piece. You have to look for that. Those are some of those symptoms that can signal that there may be something going on regarding that client, and some dissociations.
You know, I ain't gonna lie, that sounds absolutely terrifying. I just imagine like what, you know, having that, having those features, presenting these symptoms, to be afraid of taking a shower because yeah, like like, yeah, I'm not thinking about that. And as you were talking, I started thinking about that movie, that old school movie with Jack Nicholson. I forget the name of the movie, but it was something that happened in the shower. And I remember being a young child and just, I didn't see the whole movie, but just seeing that image, and it was just like, and as you spoke about that, I was like, yeah, it's an extremely vulnerable time. Just being, like being outside of yourself
Mhm.
and being that vulnerable, it just, yeah, it sounds absolutely, um it's, for me, it sounds terrifying, and I can imagine that it can produce a lot of discomfort for folks who have these disorders.
Mhm. Yeah. And like I said, that's one of the things that was new for me. Having my first client, and he was a college student. Um, and one of the things that different from being a private clinician, which I did for many years, and then transitioned into counseling at the college level, it's very similar to school counseling, where the goal is to, yes, help the student, but ultimately help them also succeed in the classroom. So going to class, going to the different things where you need to be active and a part of. And that was one of the things that they struggled with. They struggled with leaving their dorm room. They struggled with going to class. And initially, and just talking, it was just like, okay, what's going on? Um, what's happening with not going to class? And it finally came out that the struggle wasn't necessarily going to class. It was the preparing for class, which included taking a shower. And I was just like, okay. So of course I go and do all this research, and I'm like, going on with the shower, and read up on how that is a part of one of the symptoms, is just that depersonalization, that separation from self, along with it possibly being a reminder of the trauma or the vulnerability. So it is a very interesting diagnosis. It has been very interesting working with my client. It has been very interesting working with my supervisee, helping them work with their client that has it. And so it's very eye opening, and I find it very intriguing, um, and want to know more. It's just that there's very limited information out there, specifically on it. More research just needs to be done.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Like I was saying to you earlier, is like as I was looking, at the literature around this, um, to see that I was finding things from the early '90s, and and I was like, wow, like who knew, because it's, well, I mean, it came into my life in a different way, learning about this stuff, but it's like for the literature to go so far back and for it to be a diagnosis, I just don't feel like we speak about it enough.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that a lot of folks know about, it's not a go-to thing to think about yet. I think that, some of the features are things that people may deal with on on a persistent basis.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Mm-hmm.
like you mentioned that that it can be brought on from extreme trauma, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when we really think about that, like so many people are dealing with extreme trauma on a day to day,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, so remember the diagnosis for PTSD at one point was only for soldiers,
Mm-hmm.
right? And now look,
Mm-hmm.
and we've added additional letters to it, right?
Uh-huh. We have,
You know
yes.
what I'm saying? So when we,
Mhm.
and of course that's what like I was saying with PTSD or complex um PTSD, it's trauma that's happening. And now like we're saying, oh well, not only can you experience the trauma of that, you can experience a complex trauma where it's happening over and over and over again. So being in these kinds of situations, it just makes me wonder of how many people are actually living with this, yet not diagnosed, and not even recognizing that there is a diagnosis about this because there isn't enough um, awareness about this about dissociation and dissociative disorders.
Yeah, and a lot of the research that is out there, um, kind of all general give that there's about a 1.5% of the global population, not only the US population, but about 1.5% of the global population, um, has been successfully or correctly, I should say, diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder. Research also shows that it kind of tends to show up more. Some research, let me say that, says that tends to show up in women more than men. But then there's also other research that says it may be closer with men and women than people realize. But there may be a lot of men who are not willing to go to therapy, or more men who are incarcerated, and so they're just not being assessed for it. And I was like, well, that makes sense. um and I just feel like more, because it is such an expansive diagnosis, and because there are so many features and points to it, and that it shares so much with acute stress disorder, and it shares so many criteria with PTSD and complex, that there really has to be this teasing out of which one is it? Is it acute stress disorder? Is it complex PTSD? PTSD? Is it? There's even been some people that have been misdiagnosed with borderline personality disorder when it really should have been dissociative. And so, one of the key things, going back to like earlier in the conversation between the two of us, is that there has to be that criteria A for it to be dissociative identity disorder. It has to be that disruption and that disconnection of the integration of consciousness, memory, identity, emotion, perception, body representation, motor control, and behavior, in the fact that there is this alteration that you have, or the person, I should say, has developed an alter personality, or an alteration to their normal self that everyone knows. And so one of the words that they use specifically in the DSM is, why can I find it now? Of course. Um an experience of possession. So they use that wording specifically, especially maybe in more Western cultures, where when you think of it from a cultural perspective, religious perspective, kind of having two spirits or two minds or two bodies. And so there's this idea that there has been this other experience of a possession of somebody else taking over your body. And so that would equate to one somebody, but sometimes there are multiple somebodies that take over. So these multiple alters or alterations that possess the physical body. And so that's one thing that I do remember with my client, was that when they talked about themselves, it was these altars, and then there was the body. And so it's like literally the body that I saw sitting across from me was this vessel. And then inside were these different alterations. And so again, very expansive. I'm still learning. It's still new. I have, like I said, I've only been working with this client for 2 years. I know there are people who've out there been working with dissociative identity disorder and clients with dissociative identity disorder for 10, 15, 20, 30 years. So I try to go to their workshops and try to learn from them and find techniques, because it still is relatively new for me, but I also feel like it's relatively new for the mental health profession. We're still discovering things, we're still asking questions, we're still trying to figure information out. And so all we can do is keep learning. But again, encouraging people to go to therapy, encouraging people to talk about their feelings, encouraging people to hear and listen to one another. Like you said, if you had a friend who just like, oh, they're bad with their memory. Okay, that's one thing. And you can't just say that, oh my God, it's DID because they're bad with their memory. But again, if you're noticing this persistent inability to recall large chunks of time, and or added with that, and people are coming up to them when y'all are out calling them by different names. So there's those other things that have to kind of be aware of. And again, it could just be dissociative amnesia, which is one of those dissociative disorders. It may not be DID, or it could be depersonalization. But even still, without going to therapy, without talking to someone, without sharing what's going on with you, it's very hard to then help someone figure out what's going on with them.
So what you mentioned, going to therapy, to support, you know, having a diagnosis and, addressing, and then also therapy is used to support folks in dealing with and transmuting, if you will, um, the diagnosis. What exactly do you do? What do you do with this disorder, and how do you approach therapy?
Um, so it froze for just a second, but you asked me how do I deal with the disorder and what do I do in therapy? Is that what you asked? I just want to
Yeah.
make sure.
Yes, I'm sorry about that.
Okay. Um, no, you're fine. It's probably me. My computer's always like, your internet is unstable. Um, so for me, I feel like my client was very unique in that they were a college student and that they had a love for video games and a thing called Discord server, which was also new to me. So there was a lot of first for me with this client. And so learning about the Discord server and what that was, they were on Instagram a lot, they were on TikTok a lot. You know, there's a lot going on now with social media addiction coming out and people talking about that. And so there was a lot of things that I had to start ruling out, not just the diagnosis criteria. I had to just start ruling out some other influential extraneous situations. So um part of my initial work was trying to find out what was the trauma, what happened, how did this get to be a thing for you. And so we kind of first started talking about their childhood, their middle age, and early adolescence. And I learned about a series of different traumas that happened. Some of them were physical in nature, some of them were sexual in nature. And so then I was able to kind of piece that part of the puzzle together. It's like, okay, there's definitely some severe trauma that's happened in the home, that's happened in friend relationships, that's happened in romantic relationships. Got that. Then my next step was to kind of figure out how much of what they were experiencing was real in a sense of reality of it actually happening to this person, whether on the inside in their inner world or in their outer world, versus what they were creating in this Discord server. And that's where it got really complicated because in this Discord server, they were creating these different worlds and they had their friends who were on the server. They were creating worlds and they were hopping from world to world and they were doing different things and they were building communities and cities. And I was like, oh, this is great. But then it was like, oh, yeah, this altar did this and this. And I was like, wait, did this altar really do this like in real life or in this server, which is, yes, real life, but not somewhere like one. I think one of the things was like the altar ended up getting in a fight or ended up getting cut and had to go to the hospital. And so of course I'm like, wait, did this happen somewhere real? Like, is somebody bleeding somewhere and needs to go to the hospital? I need to make a phone call, or did this happen in the world that you built? And they were like, in the world. I was like, okay. Woo. And so there was a lot of that happened, and I was just like, okay, it is still reality, but this is reality in the world that you are building and creating in this Discord server. And there's the reality of um the reality of the working world, I guess is the best way I could say that. In that if somebody did get cut and was bleeding, we need to call 911 and have the actual ambulance police. And so that was a process. So then I kind of got that figured out. I was like, okay, this is so we kind of came up, we worked, and that's how I do want to say that piece as well. I think there has to be a lot of collaboration. You're going to have to work with your client because in this situation, we are not the knower. We are not. We are not the knower on so many levels. They know because it is their experience. They're the ones living it. They're the ones feeling it, breathing it. And so there has to be this good relationship. So you got to build your rapport. You got to have trust there and you got to listen. And so I listened a lot. I spent a lot of time just listening. It's like, okay, tell me about this. Tell me about that. Let me get this. So then once we got that straight, and then we're like, okay, so when you're talking about the Discord, we're going to use this language. When you're talking about actual things happening on campus or with your parents or with your sisters, we're going to use this language. So that helped kind of clear that up. And then lastly, once we got that cleared up, then we really started working on um kind of like coping skills, like, okay, how to make sure that if one of your alters is present, that they don't put your glasses somewhere where you don't know where they are, and when you wake up the next day you're late to class because you can't find your glasses. Or things with the taking of the shower. And so we were able to start working through tools and techniques, leaving messages, leaving sticky notes around, agreeing, having a conversation with the rest of the alters that we agree the glasses will always be set on the desk. We agree that the da 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 da. And so it was this collaboration really with myself and the alters that my client had to help them function a little better, making sure that they were eating. Because at one point, one alter came to the front for probably a good month and a half. And that alter came to the front because they were like, the body needs to do better and be healthier. And so they were showering regularly. They were making their classes. They were getting their work assignments in. They were eating 3 times a day. And I was like, great, I need this. Like, I really need you to stay present all the time. I know that's not realistic, but, and so in that alter being present, we were able to get some traction on them taking care of the self, of the body, of going to class and doing things. And so it was a matter of getting that consistency. So for me, again, a newbie at this, what I have learned and takeaways is it's got to be a collaboration. You've got to listen to the client. And you have to have some patience. Because there were days where I would finish the session and be like, I don't even know what's real about life anymore for me. And I would have to just go talk to another counselor, have my consultation, be like, I feel like I'm spinning out of control. Ooh, I need to do some grounding techniques for myself. But I would do that. I would do my grounding techniques. I would talk to other counselors. I would do my research, and I'd come in the next day and be like, all right, or the next week, let's get to it. But there's definitely have to be that patient with the client and patience with yourself, that you are not going to have the answers. It's going to be tiring sometimes. It's going to be frustrating sometimes. But if you just stick with it, you can help the client navigate and manage to still live um, a well life, or a healthy life, um, around having the disorder or the diagnosis.
Um, why is this important for Black folks? Like, what is the significance of understanding these disorders for Black folks?
I think the number one reason why it's important for Black people is just because I feel like historically we have not been allowed to be in tune with our bodies and our minds and our spirits. Historically, because of our history, Africans being brought over and enslaved, their culture was taken, their language was taken, their way of life was taken, their spiritual connection was taken, and so much of our wellness um relies on those very things. It relies on your spiritual connection. It relies on family connection. It relies on culture. It relies on all those pieces to the puzzle to feel fully connected to who you are. So in essence, my belief is that during that process, we just became bodies. We became bodies for work. We held on to what we could traditionally. We held on to what we could culturally. We passed things down through song, through dance, through hairstyles, cornrows, braids, all that. So we held on to it. But so much of the existence was just manual labor. You work and you go home and you sleep and you get up and you work. And there wasn't time to pay attention to how's my body feeling? How's my spirit feeling? How's my memory? And so as you move over into where we are now, 2022, therapy, counseling, the stigma within the African American community has definitely decreased. More and more people of color, especially African Americans, are going to therapy, seeking counseling, getting help, getting support. But there's still a large part of the population who feel like what happens at home needs to stay at home. We don't need to be telling our business. All some of those detrimental things, but also not listening to and paying attention to um our bodies and having knowledge and awareness. So for me, as a black woman, as a black therapist who's been doing this for 13 years and have tried to do as much as I can for my community, that's where I see there needing to be more willingness. When you know that there is that uncle at the picnic that gets a little too handsy, not just saying, oh, that's just Uncle Johnny. No, call Uncle Johnny out on that. Tell Uncle Johnny he needs to stop and let's go get some counseling so that you can understand why you're wanting to be handsy with some of the female family members who are of a certain age, and stop it, versus just kind of whatever, or, oh, yeah, that's just Aunt Susie. She keeps a flask in her hand. Well, that's called alcoholism. And let's address that, And so, but for so long, we've just, and let me be very clear, for so long we've kept it in house because it wasn't safe to let it out the house. We
That's right.
couldn't go to the white man and say, hey, this is what's going on. They didn't care. There weren't a lot of black therapists and counselors and psychiatrists and psychologists out there. So it did stay in home. You went to your pastor, maybe, or you went to maybe that trusted mother of the community or the neighborhood, and y'all talked. But for a lot of it, it stayed in the house because that's where safety was. That was the only safe place you had. And so now trying to open that up and say it's still safe to come out, it sometimes feels safe, but then when you have Eric Garner and George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and all these things happening, it's starting to be like, no, I don't know that it's safe. Like, because stuff is still happening to us and it seems like it's ramped up. And so there's this need to go back to what we know, which is keep it on the inside. And we have to not keep it on the inside because there could be people, family members struggling with acute stress disorder. There could be family members struggling with complex PTSD. There could be family members with borderline, and there could even be family members with dissociative identity disorder. But if we're not talking about it and not sharing our feelings and not being truthful and open about what we're feeling, what we're seeing, what we're thinking, then it just stays unaddressed and not treated. And so for me, the big thing is talk. Tell people what you're feeling. Tell people what you're thinking. Ask questions about therapy. Find somebody that you know that looks like you, um, that is a therapist or has some knowledge, and ask questions. We're here. We are out here. There are Black and brown therapists in Asheville, and in other areas. And even if we don't have openings for clients, most of us are still willing to talk and have conversation and at least push you in the right direction or get you some support and help. So for Black people, we've got to start talking about it and listening to our bodies and watching our children and our loved ones and addressing things when we see that they're happening.
I think thank you so much for highlighting that. I think that it brings me back to like how important it is as a therapist for you to listen. Like you mentioned that that's what you did with your client, or that's what you're doing with your client, that it's a collaboration with the client, but you're also in this place of just listening, right? And listening without judgment, because you're trying to figure something out. So you're trying to rule some stuff out. So you're not just like, there it is, that's that. You see what I'm saying? Like there's an openness to it. And the reason why I feel like that's important is tied into what you said about the lack of trust that the Black community has with mental health and professionals in general. Because like, yes, we, like I was told, like, you don't air your dirty laundry, especially about anything in the family. Like, yeah, you keep that, and that is what created patterns of harm for a lot of us, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then simultaneously, like knowing that if I were to tell somebody about what possibly, happened, or, if you go out and tell somebody that, you know, DSS, CPS, the Child Protective Services could get called in. People
Mm-hmm.
can go to jail. Like all this kind of stuff is like it's a real thing. And I think that the greater safety that we have, that we know that we can have, um, then it allows us, and for me, this is a call more to the professionals than the individuals, because like, like I have to be that therapist. Like you're modeling something for folks, that you're showing up for your client in this way of observation without judgment. You're there to listen without judgment. You are there to support them, right? And not every therapist does that. You know what I'm saying? Regardless of race, regardless of color. But I think that that is such an important thing for our community, because there's a very, very real lack of safety for us, which then
Mm-hmm.
also exacerbates our stress, which then
Uh-huh.
could
Mm-hmm.
lead
Yep.
us down the path of
Mm-hmm.
having these disorders, right? And then you don't have anybody to talk to. Just thinking about, like, when I was saying how, like, wow, it's when you shared some of the features, and I felt like, wow, that felt so, it feels terrifying to even think about it, but then I also think about, like, when you don't have someone to talk to and you're always talking to yourself. I'm going down a little bit of a rabbit hole here because I read a lot of literature and we don't have enough time. But I thank you for sharing exactly how you deal with your client, and so that folks can know not only how to treat people as a professional, but also how they can be treated as a
Mm-hmm.
client. And that's very, very important, you know, given the circumstances that we have, for us in the United States, dealing with the enslavement, being taken away from everything we know and being enslaved.
Mm-hmm.
For those of us that are here, because we know you have the folks that are labeled black here that are not from that, um they didn't experience that. Their families were here prior to enslavement. But then also the colonialism that has happened all around the globe,
Mm-hmm.
genocide, like all of these extremely traumatic events, and then not necessarily having the safety to share that I'm in
Mm-hmm.
pain, that I'm uncomfortable, that I'm suffering right now, because everything, everything came underneath this rule of, like, yo, like, either you normal or abnormal. If you abnormal, you done.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So a lot of performance, and not allowing us to have the space to actually be. But yeah, like, it's so important that we talk about this, that we cultivate relationships
Mm-hmm.
for ourselves, like intentionally cultivate relationships that we can create a sense of safety for ourselves with the relationship, right? Not accepting just any old flimsy relationship where Joanna's gonna go run your business, but you feel like she's the only person you can talk to. No, you can
Right.
expect more for yourself, expect more for your life, because it's those things as well. Like, before you may be able to find a therapist, to have someone to talk to is important,
It definitely
right?
is. It definitely is. I appreciate, yeah, all and echo all that you just said. It is very, it can be very cylindric or cyclic in that, like you said, there's all this stuff going on, but we don't feel safe to talk about it. But then holding it in adds more stress, and it goes around and around and around, or we don't know what is happening because we're not aware of different things, and so it's something weird, but you don't want to talk about it because again, it doesn't feel safe. And so then you hold it in, and then holding it in causes stress, and then that stress can lead to more things happening with your health and wellness and mind and body and spirit. And so it is, it can be a very detrimental cycle.
Mm-hmm.
um and so yeah, talking about it, like you said, having um someone, not just that person who you know is going to run your business, but someone who can hear you, listen to you, um and say, hey, I think you might need to talk to a professional, or hey, I'm a professional, but this is above my pay grade, let me get you to somebody else. And being willing and being okay to do that, to get better. I think sometimes, um there's this thought that because we came through a struggle, we always have to struggle. And that's not true. That's not our truth. It shouldn't have to be a struggle. If I can live a certain life, and with the education that I have gotten and the education that my parents afforded me to have, if I can live a certain way that my child doesn't have to struggle, why would I not? Like I don't want them to have to struggle. And if they can live, I have, if that child has a child and that child doesn't have to struggle, and we can start a new narrative of, being black doesn't equal oppression. Being black doesn't equal a struggle. Being black, so many of these things have been put on us, and we continue to carry them. And it's like, that's not my piece of cake to carry. So I'm going to stop. And I think
Right.
some of that comes with the understanding and the realization that we deserve to take care of ourselves. We deserve to be well. We deserve to be healthy. We deserve to be treated equally under the law. Those might be ones we have to fight a little bit harder for. But these that just comes with making a choice. That just comes with choosing to eat better. That comes with choosing to go to therapy. That comes with choosing to talk to someone. Those are choices that we can make as a people, and then hold each other accountable that we do it, so that at least some facets of our life can start to see some positive improvement. And then when you're healthier and you feel better and you're moving better and your spirit feels at peace, then it's easier to fight for the things that we're going to have to really fight for, which is equality under the law. Because that's going to take a lot of work. We're not there yet. I don't know that we'll ever get there, to be honest, but we can work better when we're feeling better. And right
Well, which
now, there's so many people that aren't feeling well, and then you're asking them to take on these other roles and other work, and I'm just trying to survive. And we've got to get out of that as a people. We got to stop just surviving. It's time for us to thrive, and taking care of your mental health is how you thrive.
and I absolutely agree with you. I think, and I was like, well, that's the reason why we always in survival mode, right? Because you know things can really change when we take care of ourselves. And even I want to just add, even when because people say, oh well, I live in a food desert, or oh, like these things it exists. It's true.
Mhm. Mhm.
When you decide that you deserve more, that you when you value yourself,
Mhm.
opportunities open, and so like that might be some of the greatest struggles sometimes, is just recognizing that I am worthy of having, you know physical and mental health, well-being.
Mhm.
I'm worthy of that. I deserve that. Because the part of the narrative was that we didn't deserve that, right? Which is why we got
Mhm.
the life that we got. So it's a complex kind of thing. And in this last moment, as we're wrapping up today, it's like just bringing it back to the disorders themselves. Is like, you know we have, as Black people around this globe, have experienced a lot of trauma,
Mhm.
significant trauma that is continuous, right?
Mhm.
And so the idea of, like, really stepping into this place of like, all right, well, now I know about this. Let me see if if any of this resonates with what's happening with me in my life. Let me see if there are any opportunities for me to get the mental health support that I need, so that I can, mentally, when you're doing better mentally, it automatically shows in your body.
Mhm.
You know what I'm saying? So,
Mhm.
in this last minute, Dr. No, is there anything that you'd like to share with us?
I would just like to share first, thanks for having me on. This was amazing, and ask me back anytime.
Okay.
As you can see, I can talk. And just want to encourage those who are listening to to know that you are worth caring for yourself. You are worthy of living well and living good and living a healthy life. And that includes taking care of your physical wellness, your mental wellness, your social wellness. And if you don't know where to look, just ask somebody. Start asking questions. Our organization, a therapist like me, You can find us at atherapistlikeme.org. And there are therapists on there from BIPOC and other historically marginalized communities that have openings, that have space. And if they don't have openings, they can try to connect you with somebody who does. So just start the process, take that first step. I know it may be scary, it may be new, but in the long run, being well is worth it.
Being well is worth it. Put that on a t-shirt. Thank you so much.
Put it on a t-shirt.
Put it on a t-shirt. My name again is Ethiopia Ewart. Today we had Dr. Noriel Armstrong on talking about what are dissociation and dissociative disorders. This is Black Mental Health Matters. Thank you so much for tuning in and see you next time. Bye.